Thank you, Prakash. If I could invite our discussants, Professor Jian and Tansen, Professor Sen. Thank you. So I think as in the first panel, we'll have each of the discussants speak for up to 5 minutes, and they each will speak in succession about the papers that were presented. So, Professor Liu.
Okay. Nirmala Sharma, you touched about interesting and also sensitive part with regard to the life, his activities in China. Yes, his purpose was to try to win independence by seeking Japanese assistance for his support. And the question is, why Subhash, Jawaharlal, Bose rely on and have confidence in Japan to help India to win independence? What was his grounds? He talked so, he thought so, but his thinking was different from what he used to think. And also he thought and talked in a way quite different from average Indians and almost all the rest in the rest of the world, other thinkers, other people, including common people's thinking. Subhash, he was a very smart, very intelligent person. How could he rely on Japan so lightly? And we know that Rabindranath and Tagore, both are two people are well known in India, and both of them were Bengali. And Tagore, before he went to Japan, he thought highly of Japan. Also, he put his hope on Japan in leading the whole Asia towards modernity. But when he really set his foot on Japan, he found a lot of problems. Found nationalism in Japan growing, and then that he publicly denounced Japanese militarism. And but later that when Japan really occupied China, and Tagore wrote poems and delivered speeches, writing letters to Japanese poet, condemning Japanese occupation of China. Why did Subhash? Both were Bengalis, they were contemporaries. Didn't he know Rabindranath Tagore's reputation? Didn't he didn't pay attention to what Tagore had done and had said? I think that you made the interesting comparison. I think that point was very good between Subhash and Wang Jingwei. Wang Jingwei, interestingly, that in China, he was all the time regarded as a traitor of the Chinese nation, and in collaboration with the Japanese aggressors. Although he said that my purpose is to save China from disasters in a roundabout way, 曲线救国. And I think that he was sent to, he was denounced by the Chinese. And in recent years, there was a phenomenon in China. So some people began to think about Wang Jingwei, his cooperation with Japan in a different way. And that's an interesting point. That also about Chiang Kai-shek. Did he really want to fight with Japanese aggressors, or he was reluctant to fight against the Japanese aggressors? This point also needs further clarification. As we know that Chiang Kai-shek was the actual leader of the Chinese people in their fight against the Japanese occupation of China. Finally, I have a question that, so Subhash was a well-known, famous Bengali leader. And when he worked together with Japan, wasn't he afraid of someday his reputation would be greatly affected because of his doing so? That's my comment. Thank you.
Okay, I was just looking at the nature of papers, the 5 papers on comparative study of India-China, 1 on India only, and Nirmala's paper on India-China connections, not comparisons. I don't know how many of you know about Nirmala. Many of the historians of China in India are retiring. It's a dying breed, and I feel happy that new emerging scholar like Nirmala, historian, are coming up. I think it will be the next generation. I know Nirmala has spent days and perhaps also nights in the Indian archives looking through various files, and we should appreciate the work she has been doing. And let me also mention the importance of the period that she is looking at. I think this is something quite neglected. If we are to understand the contemporary relations between India and China, I think this period of Republican China is quite important. This is when Tibet becomes an issue. This is when borders are becoming important in India-China relations. This is when the two countries are collaborating in many different ways. And as Nirmala shows, there are problems as well. Not all views are same among the Indians with regard to China. Now that said, I'll will focus on 3 aspects of Nirmala's paper. The idea is to give her constructive comments, so don't feel bad. One point that I think I should point out right away, as you said, are you the only one working on INA in China? No. Priyadarshi Mukherjee has written 2 books on Netaji in China. He has translated a number of Chinese language material from 1943, 1944 in Chinese press, especially about what they are writing about INA and Netaji, which is very important. The view that you are giving is from INA side. And as Paula mentioned, sources, and I said not all sources are same, right? Some are legitimate, some are not. And so I think it will be important to look at the Chinese sources. Then there are British sources, right? I mean, if you look at the Foreign Office files, there are detailed records about INA in China. I think that's very important as well. And there's a 4th group of sources that's from Japan. Japanese are also writing about the Indians who are participating in their movement. So I think in order to reach a proper analysis, do a proper analysis and reach a proper conclusion, you need to consult all different kinds of sources and see what we understand of Netaji, even though he's a Bengali. I think it's difficult to understand Bengalis. But I think it would be good to see how there were different perspectives. And even from the Indian side, I think the modern review that came out from Calcutta and the Indian Annual Registry also has a number of issues regarding how to look at Japan and how to look at China at this very important period of world history. So I think that, and modern review is quite important because there are people writing back and forth, talking to each other, and Netaji, of course, figures in that as well. So the first point I was going to make is the nature of secondary literature, where I think Priyadarshi's work is quite important, and then the nature of the primary sources, where I think you have to do a more comprehensive work. The second issue is this idea of pan-Asianism that you referred to. I think that is very important given what Japan is doing. It's not only important for Japan, but also to India and China. All three countries were involved in this hyperbolic issue of pan-Asianism in the beginning of the 20th century, and then when the Japanese started using military, it started collapsing. But then there were, as you pointed out, Raj Bihari Bose. There's also Taraknath Das, those who were based in Japan, who, despite the military actions that were taking place by the Japanese, were still insisting Japan should be the leader of Asia, no matter where they go next. So how do their views, Taraknath Das and Raj Bihari Bose's ideas, fit with Netaji? Is Netaji still insisting that Asia should be led by Japan? And that brings me to the third and the final question. What you said is a China question. Is it really a Japan question? Right? And just because we are at the India-China Institute, not everything has to do with India and China, right? Sometimes your conclusion may take you to a different point. And if you look at the literature, the discussion that is going on, the issue is not just to sympathize with China, it is how do we deal with Japan? What is Japan really up to? So Taraknath Das, Raj Bihari Bose, and others living abroad are still insisting that Japan should be the leader of China, of Asia, while those people living in India saying we have to sympathize with the Chinese and support the Chinese in their fight against Japan. So there is this issue is what question should we ask? Right, and just because Madhvi is your advisor and you are at this East Asian Studies thing, I think you should broaden your investigation. And then if you look at the question of Japan, I think things will be more easier to understand than if you just look at the China question, right? Okay, I'll end with that.
Oh, I should say I apologize for not introducing the discussants, but the biographies are in the brochure here. Please do read them.
Mark, me first. Okay, thanks. Yes, first of all, thank you, Ing Hong, for writing this paper. It is very interesting, and I think some of my comments, as I was rereading the paper this morning, many of my comments are drawn from that rereading, and I think you've in some ways answered some of the points by way of your presentation. In other words, you seem to have, maybe you got an advanced copy of my remarks here and did your presentation, because I think some of the slides which you had to go through very quickly really address some important concepts and issues. And essentially my hope is that in improving, working towards the next version of the paper, you'll simply incorporate some of the ideas and larger points you have in the slides into the text of the paper. I think we see in this paper, as we also will see in discussing Prakash's paper, that regime type, when we're talking about land acquisition, Indian democracy, authoritarian China, really don't matter at all in understanding different patterns of land acquisition and resistance to largely state-led land acquisition practices. I learned a lot about recent patterns of land acquisition in China. You draw in the paper a boundary I had not yet seen before, which is that of pre and post 1998. I'm not exactly clear why that particular day, but something very important happened around the late 1990s, and it's driven largely by changes a few years earlier, say mid 1990s, in fiscal policy, in the revenue sources that local governments in China, especially rural townships and counties, where can they get their money from? And by the mid-1990s, it's no longer sustainable to go in and squeeze direct taxes from peasants. We've led to lots of protests, of course. Now we're going to derive our income, local governments are going to derive our income from land use fees, essentially. And so, as you say in the paper, amazing, 60% of all local government revenues comes from these land use fees. Now, that's up from only 9% before 1998. So there's been this whole sea change in the way in which local finances work, and it's all centered on land now. This is just why it's so important, and I think highlighting that change was very good in the paper. One of the things that occurred to me as I read the paper, and this came through in the presentation also, is you make frequent use of successful land acquisition and failed or stalled land acquisition. And what does this mean exactly in any context, but particularly in China and India? To some of us, probably me included, I would certainly say, delayed or stalled land development project, is that a successful or a failed outcome? Is a protest that leads to a cancellation of a land development project, a positive or a successful outcome? I think in the paper you say oftentimes that you should have this chart that was also in your presentation of 600 some odd stalled land projects in India, and you treated this as a problem or a challenge or a negative sort of thing. And I'm not saying it means that all is well, but it means that I think saying whether that this indicates development, which I'll talk about later, or that it's a positive or a negative outcome, or a successful or a failed outcome is problematic, and we need some other way of understanding what a stalled versus a rapidly enacted land transfer means. You say in the paper you talk about a few cases of successful land transfers in Gujarat and Tamil Nadu. And you say elsewhere, quote, many states witnessed the stagnancy of land acquisition in other states besides those two. You cite a scholar who says that stagnancy of land acquisition is one of the biggest problems in India's future development. There's that word again, development. So again, it's to repeat the question, isn't stagnancy of land acquisition, if it prevents unfair land appropriation, isn't that a good thing? Isn't that a positive outcome? Also addressed in the presentation, but not in the paper, was essentially, I think we need to problematize this word land acquisition. Who is acquiring the land, and from whom is the land being taken? And if we way oversimplify, and no one's doing that, and you didn't, you think of this poor individual household or freeholder, with the land, and then here comes the state to grab it away. They're seizing their land. It's much more complicated than that, as you've shown. But if we start asking questions like, the land is held in common, it's held by a collective in the case of China, it's held by the state, urban land is held by the state, collective land in rural China is held by the collective. What are we really acquiring, and what is being traded when we talk about this? I think land use rights are being transferred more specifically, rather than just saying land acquisition is happening. Finally, the paper engages, as I mentioned earlier, these big concepts in the title: development, justice. The title is saying that something is between justice and development. But it seemed to me, as I read the paper, development and modernity as conceived by the state planners in China and India, you seem to be coming to the probably accurate conclusion that development so conceived is coming at the expense of social justice, that there's a trade-off between the two. You say so directly at the end of the paper, which I'll just read briefly. Say, even though the tension and conflict are growing rapidly, Chinese land acquisition is still far more effective than India's, which guaranteed the need of development, however, at the cost of justice and stability of the society. And then India, as a capitalist democracy, land acquisitions there have been stalled due to the rampant protests of the displaced people. The result is the slowdown of economic growth in India and a zero-sum game for all concerned parties. So you note that China, has achieved development, while India seems to lack both development, or slower development, slowdown of economic growth, as you say, and lacks social justice. But if there really are trade-offs, then you would take slower development for a little more social justice, or you take no development to preserve that. Of course, they're not so directly tied in that kind of positive sum relationship. But you know, when you start talking about win-win games and zero-sum games, that this is somewhat implied. So one question is this, and also in the realm of India-China connections, let me point out that Ying-hong is involved in a translation project to translate the selected works of Gandhi into Chinese, coming out later this year. And so he is not only interested in India-China connections, but I think is actively in that space because, as we know, as many of us who've been to China, you see there is a growing interest, let's say, in Indian philosophy, in 20th century Indian philosophy, especially in the works of Gandhi. But my question is, you know, rural development, which is central in a lot of thinking by people in the 20th century in both India and China of what our new society will look like, of where we as a nation are headed. And rural development is central, I think, in both the imaginations of Indian and Chinese intellectuals in the 20th century. If rural development is a means of achieving justice, we're improving the lives of the poorest in the society, then how can land play a part in this? How can land be most effectively used, distributed to achieve rural development? And it seems to me, I get from these debates that you're writing about in land acquisition, that the only answer is that it has to be urbanized. That the way to achieve justice, social justice, the way to bring people out of rural poverty is to turn them into urban people. And this results in the kind of paradox that many have noted, which is that land is being urbanized much faster than people. I'm saying this from the China angle much more so than India, with which I'm less familiar. But I think that it's worth reflecting, if you're interested in engaging development and justice, that then, what is the goal of development, as Vamsi asked an earlier presenter this morning. And finally, just very final point, very short, is you talked about in the presentation local creative practices in land use, and you had a few cases. You've done field work in some cases, or you're going to be talking about Wukan and others. I think the paper would benefit greatly from drawing on your observations on what you're calling local creative practices, but because I think essentially the most interesting and potentially influential outcomes are generated in that local creative space rather than from a new land use law passed by the central government in either place at any given time. Thanks.
Professor Vasudevan.
Well, I think Ying-hong, you have very substantial responses already to your paper, and I think not just Professor Frazier, but I think Prakash in many ways has raised a number of questions which perhaps will help you fill out some of the Indian details. So I don't have that much to do. I will, though, just tread over some ground once again. Just for the record, as I said to you, I think in between when we met, I really did enjoy the sections of this paper which dealt with both the legislation as well as the practice in China. I found that extremely interesting. I found especially the local analyses. I think Professor Frazier has already pointed that out, which dealt with the fiscal record of the end of the 20th century and the way in which, for instance, the percentages that were being held back from the actual the levies that were being taken from the acquisition, and the way in which there was a mismatch between the rewards that the community received and the amount that the local government retained. This leading in turn to a sense of both injustice, privation, etc. This is rather an interesting insight. But I think it's an interesting insight precisely because you have this extremely wealthy description of the guarantees which were already in place in the past whenever the commune alienated land, or when the state actually within the existing framework and regime actually compensated the commune or other users for the land that it was actually taking over. I think that run of legislative history, as well as, and I don't think it's just legislative history, it seems to speak for a lot of activity on the ground as well, the way in which you put it. I think that was really a remarkable aspect of this paper, and if there are examples which are then given of the way in which that has developed both in the past as well as in the late 1990s and 2000s, I think that would be extremely unusual as far as the literature is concerned, and it would help answer many of the questions concerning both satisfaction and dissatisfaction concerning the acquisition of land for industrial and other purposes recently. Quite clearly, since I'm highlighting that, it's clear that perhaps I'm a bit worried about the Indian side of the comparison. But I don't think actually it's something I wish to go into in great detail, because some of these issues have been raised by Prakash, because he's pointed, I think, to one or two issues which perhaps you could take into consideration in order to nuance the way in which you describe the process of acquisition in India, which is that, for instance, a lot of the land which is alienated, which is actually taken over, belongs to one sphere, but in many cases the disagreements that are happening are not concerning that sphere. They are concerning government-owned land, which is forest land. And in fact, the disputes therefore occur because the government itself has decided that nobody else has a right to that but itself. It is not actually planning out, according to any strict regulations that it has set up for itself, a compensatory apparatus which seriously takes into consideration the full round of social presences in a particular area. So that in fact there is no attempt to understand the way in which the Adivasi may be using that particular property, the range of commitments that he has on that property. Now, all this is considered the realm of a kind of anthropology, which, if it finally inflicts itself on the government through the non-governmental organization, will be considered to be relevant. But until that is actually done, the government will proceed with the process of alienation and will not consider that the rules that it is set for the acquisition of property and the alienation of property, the decision of just compensation, the salatium, etc., that seriously appears in this particular case. So this, I think, Prakash has put forward very adequately, and it's something that you could take into consideration, because a lot of the justice factor that you're dealing with is not concerning the acquisition in the strict sense, because there's no need to acquire. The government already possesses it. So I think that's a dimension which would be an interesting one to add to the way in which you deal with this. Now, quite clearly, the issue here, as far as you're concerned, is that acquisition itself is meant to provide justice, and that you highlighted in your slide. That is that it's meant to avoid the land mafia. It's meant to avoid persons who do not have a public vision about property. It's meant to avoid all these particular agencies. But I think at one point there is a factor in the comparison between India and China that you have to take into consideration, which is that the right of the government to decide on that justice is disputed in India, whereas it is not disputed in the case of China beyond a certain point. That is that the government itself has established its property rights over time. It may have been ritualistic, but it may have been through specific laws that affect the commune. It may have been through the planned economy. It may be through the immediate aftermath of the planned economy when adjustments were made. But whatever the case, the government has asserted a particular right over property in a way in which it has not done in the Indian case. In the Indian case, there is a thing called the property holder who, through that chain which Prakash pointed out, through that chain, has established his right to that bhumi. There is no question about it. And in fact, this ritual of the use of the chain is rather an important one. I mean, I've been present. I think practically every Indian has been present at some stage now when the Tehsildar actually marks out the property and actually puts it into the large map, etc., etc. So there is a particular regime of ownership which is involved here, which somewhere you have to bear in mind. This does not actually mean, though, that regime of ownership cannot in some sense be diluted, adjusted, concessions made, etc. How these concessions are made are the other dimension perhaps that you could gradually slip into the Indian case study. All right, which is, you've left the ends of alienation slightly on the margin here. And the political economy within which the alienation is taking place, and the way this is seen, is one of the most burning questions within India. As Professor Frazier pointed out, what is the vision of the future that, in fact, people are playing with? What is the vision of myself as a farmer? Is it that I should commit myself either to a migratory existence in which my land plays less and less of a role, or is it an existence in which I am driven to suicide? These are essential questions. So agriculture, political economy, I would have said, you cannot leave out when you are dealing with this issue. It's become too loaded an issue from these points of view. So these little additions, I would have said, in introducing some of these regime issues Prakash has raised, that may help you just develop this paper. But I think the Chinese section is extremely rich. Perhaps because you raise these questions on this side, you'll begin raising them on that side as well. You may find that you are making the Chinese section even richer than it already is. My congratulations.
Thank you very much. So our final change of guard, Professors Acharya and Kurian, please.
Good evening, and very glad to be here, coming here for the first time, and really been following the work that Ashok and the new school and the ICI in particular has been doing, and I must say that I'm extremely delighted at the broad expanse that you are now getting into. I mean, we were there before when you started these conversations the first time, and I remember it's a great distance we've traveled. So I'm glad to be in on this project. And now, quickly, how much? 5 minutes? So I'm going to be quick and not get into the details. Now, the paper that I got, Prakash, and your presentation are obviously slightly different. It was a whopper of a paper, 37 pages, and it just went on and on. And since I did take some time to read that, I'm not going to respond so much to your presentation because there are some differences there. But I think in essentials you still have kept to the main argument that you were outlining in the text that you sent. So I think it will not be very, very substantially different. And in any case, there are 3 points that I would like to make. I think the first point relates to the theoretical framework that you have employed. Now, in the beginning, you're really concerned with, as you put it, this is it here. Sorry. Yeah. that you are looking at the need to look at the social and political foundations of long entrenched and deep patterns of social and political inequalities. You are looking, then you go on to look at the interlinkages of land acquisition regime with the closely related political and economic institutions. And then you say that, and then you bring in the deeply entrenched nature of the apparently unjust systems of land acquisition processes that independent India borrowed from its colonial rulers. Now, if we put these three elements together, I find that we are actually raising a contradictory perspective, a contradictory kind of a, because if we take point number one, which is the interlinkages of land acquisition regime with the closely related political and economic institutions, we are clearly looking at the nature of the independent Indian state and its efforts to, while it continued with the legacy of the colonial legacy, which was the 1894 law, but its efforts to set the whole developmental agenda through a constitution on a very specific path of development, which guaranteed certain rights, and property was a fundamental right to begin with. Subsequently, it shifted from being a fundamental right to being a statutory right. But that's part of the politics that comes into play. So this whole grounding of the protection of rights in constitutional and legal framework, I think is where then when we get back to the unjust systems of the acquisition process, then I really don't know what is going to be a theoretical framework here. If we are looking at the relationship between the state and the individual in the context of how property rights are being grounded and being guaranteed, then the whole framework within a constitutional and a legal kind of a sense, then you have to explain how do you bring in this unjust dimension. It's in that sense, I would sort of go slightly differently from what Mark was saying earlier, that in that sense, therefore, there is no difference between India and China, that one is democratic and one is authoritarian, because I think that it's precisely this distinction and the manner in which, I mean, the word constitution and constitutional guarantees and rights and property rights is simply not there in your paper. And I was thinking I would ask you this question, that because it's such a significant element when you are looking at the whole concept of property rights, that either you've done it in a, for a very specific reason, that is, you've left it out deliberately entirely. So I would like to really ask you, why is it? Because you are clearly looking at the nature of the state and the individual and trying to examine property rights in that way. So I'd like to know that's the first set of issues that I would like to bring up. The second is the historical dimension, which again I think is extremely, it's a fantastic part of your paper, that you're trying to bring in this whole historical aspect. And yet I feel that there is a certain gap, again, as we start to look at the whole historical issue. You have identified this chain, Zarib, I mean, again, interesting relic. So you go back to the Mughal period in many sense, which were the practices which the British employed. But the link between the Mughal period and the British is really, I mean, you take it very tenuously, and then the link between, say, the Mughals and the post-colonial is also not. So see, why I'm saying is that if you look at our constitutional guarantees and the way in which the initial set of land reforms start to take off, the terms that are used go back to the Mughal period. In fact, one of the major arguments of that time was to make land reforms more effective. The terminology of the land holdings was Mughal. And therefore, somebody like Irfan Habib, for instance, is completely missing from your references. I mean, he's, if at all, the authoritative source on agrarian reforms of the Mughal period and the agrarian system. So if history is really going to be central in your introductory framework, I would suggest that you do look at some of these linkages, and Habib has done a good job in terms of the way he looks at the Mughal period, then the British period, and So, I mean, there are problems with which you will, once you look at the whole discourse, you will see that he has been contested. But I think it's one of the finest analysis of the Mughal agrarian system and the way in which it starts to be inherited by the British. Now, one final thing about this business of property rights, political relationship between the individual citizens and the sovereign, this whole eminent domain theory. What I find interesting is something, I mean, Hari raised this point about the fact that acquisition is not a problem because the land is owned by the state. I don't think that's entirely it, because after all, why was there a need for land acquisition? Just, if the land is owned by the state in terms of forests and so on, then why do you need a land acquisition? Because the question is that you are taking the land from individually owned landholdings and so on. That's one. The other side of the coin here, very interestingly, is why does in the 90s this move speed up? That before then, we were happy to tinker with the existing law. You had amendments coming up galore. In 77, you had this major move shift from being a fundamental to a statutory right. But why is it the 90s that you suddenly see this process speeding up? And two things are happening in India which have a bearing on your relationship between property rights and the state. One is the fact that liberalization comes to India, reforms start. And that is when the emergence of political parties begins in a fundamental way. You see the era of coalition politics mostly goes back to the late 80s, early 90s, when different interest groups are responding to the liberalization process. There's not time enough to go into detail, but there is an interesting link between the emergence of new interest groups which coalesce into political parties, which then feeds into the very vibrant kind of state politics and new groupings that come up. So the fact is that you have a process which begins in the 90s, which is related to the liberalization process, which obviously then is looking at the way in which agrarian land or rural land holdings are now going to be used in the next stage of the developmental process. I mean, that's where the whole land acquisition business, I mean, then I think we need to really look more closely at the nexus between the state, property rights, and the kind of players that are involved. So it's ultimately, of course, the picture becomes more and more differentiated. You have a whole lot of, you've pointed that out very well. It's a fairly kind of a complex dynamics at work. But I think the core really, because it seems to me after the initial point that there is just too many frameworks that you are trying to bring in. And I'm not too sure whether, it's one thing to have a multidisciplinary kind of an approach, but another thing to bring frameworks which at some level become contradictory. And so I just would like you to give some focus to that, and I'll stop. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sanjay. Prakash, I enjoyed your paper, but the presentation even better. I go along with Alka on that. I have 5 points for your considerations. I think what I'd like to see more in your paper is a far more critical engagement with discourses of dispossession, and especially how the state delegitimizes many of these discourses of dispossession. And I say this because of I'm very attracted to the tenor and tone of your argument, and I think you might find this useful to actually engage with that delegitimization process, because there's this entire delegitimization of the huge corpus of customary law and customary institutions and community access to land, which we need to kind of bring in, which would kind of embellish some of the strong arguments you're trying to, or strengthen the arguments you're trying to make. So just an illustrative example, because this is your paper attempts sort of a comparative India-China perspective. Look at the very similar forced sedentarization policies that both Indian and the Chinese state governments, Indian and the Chinese state follow towards pastoral nomads. And that again busts the binary of the authoritarian versus democratic, the labeling that India-China comparisons are very often fraught with, and which is absolutely it's really not useful to actually push that. So it might be useful to look at the forced sedentarization policies and see how pastoral nomads are delegitimized and portrayed as irresponsible land managers, as backward, as wasteful, and so this entire discourse enables the state in the process to acquire huge swathes of these rangelands and pasture areas, and what has been the default state policy has been to vacate these spaces of people. And the problem, as we notice in India, just as well as much in China, is that these spaces refuse to remain empty. And it is bringing in its wake a whole, at one level, a severe livelihood crisis for these pastoral nomads, but also at another level, a very severe ecological, crisis of severe proportions. So this could be one lens for you to kind of look at. A second one could be to, and again, given the tenor and tone of your paper, it might be useful to bring people back into these narratives more centrally. Of course, they are present everywhere in your paper, in your argument. But the reason I say this is because somehow I get the impression that, and I read your paper a couple of times, and so somehow I get the impression that inadvertently the role of people seems to be reduced to being a mere site of state action or inaction. It's an inadvertent impression, but it gives the impression that there's given the supervening authority of and power of the state, the role of the people is just that of as a site of state action or inaction. So it might be useful to, for instance, invoke Gyanendra Pandey and ask, what right does a subaltern citizen have, and what claims does he or she have on state and state resources, and to engage more critically with what Pandey says about the living, and very eloquently and powerfully, I think, about the living of individual and collective lives and the limitations of that living. So some of those narratives would come through if you were to bring people back more centrally into this account of yours. And a third point is, you asked the question, do state governments exist, in your paper? Sorry, yes, in local governments, I meant state. That's just a default Indian way of, equating to yes, do local governments exist? And you answer that they are missing in action from some of these debates. But I would say, if you were to look at it from the point of view of the subaltern citizen and ask the question, do local governments exist? Oh, yes, they do. And they wield enormous discretionary power, and the subaltern citizen as very much at the receiving end of that enormous discretionary power. And just an illustrative example to substantiate that would be to look at the selective implementation of the Forest Rights Act of 2006. And you ask and if you could ask the question about the role of subnational governments, the local governments, in implementation of a so-called progressive act like the FRA, you look at the very regressive piece of notification from the West Bengal Forest Department in 2011, which actually goes on to say that the FRA is not applicable to the Sundarbans. So in one stroke, the state is wielding this enormous discretionary power and creating a huge livelihood crisis for a whole set of users who are dependent on this ecosystem. And so that's then just to my fourth point. There's again, I would like to engage with a question that you ask in the paper: what difference does Indian federalism make? That's one of the questions you throw up. I would think that the more interesting intellectual question would be to ask, what difference does asymmetrical federalism make? Precisely because it has huge implications for the questions on resources and rights, and how questions of accountability need to be placed at the intersection between questions of between resources and rights, and the rights of citizens to access these. So if I were to rephrase the question, has asymmetric federalism delivered? Has this, what has been a very, projected as a very excellent, positive example of institutional innovation in terms of constitutional safeguards for customary law, has it delivered over the course of the 6 decades, the Scheduled 6 areas and so on and so forth? You see a huge set of institutional gridlocks that have come in the way to undermine some of these. So that would be, again, another rich vein to tap. And I'll just one last, the fifth point to conclude. You spoke about social protest movements. It might be useful to also ask, do all social movements engage with the state in similarly, in the sense, i.e., do they always engage do they always engage with the state in an oppositional way? Because you could also look at the very interesting puzzle that why does a socio-ecological movement like Chipko speak quote unquote the language of the state, and why does it very consciously decide not to question state legitimacy? That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that the emerging scholars have benefited from a very rich set of comments by more established scholars, so I think it's a success already from that point of view. But are there questions, comments for the speakers and or the discussants? I'm not sure we're going to have much time for responses unless we go beyond 4:15, which well, I think we're already scheduled to end at 4:15 the entire session, including Professor Frazier's remarks. So unless there's permission from the Supreme Head to go beyond 4:15, I think we'll have to basically have very brief or no responses from the speakers. But are there any questions, comments, suggestions that we can take up now? Yes, please. And I think, as before, the request remains that if you don't mind coming here, it will aid the videotaping, but if you object, you may speak from wherever you are. Yeah.
I have each comment for each of the first 2 articles,
yes.
2 presentations, and those were already highlighted, pointed out by the discussants. I just want to reinforce my my impression of the importance of these aspects. So for the first presenter, Nomura, I think it's really, it will be very nice to frame your project that for people who are not historian of this particular period to understand the significance, or how your project fits in the large discourse out there. Because I think Professor Sen's point of framing and making it more connected with discourses, the debate in the field, that will be very great. That's my impression to the first thing I write down, framing the question and how you talk to other specialists in the field. And the second one, again, Professor Frazier also raised, that is the local cases. In the end, I find the local cases are most interesting element of your project. And if you can explain why these two cases, what are your initial findings? The Sikh versus Wukong and Gujarat versus Chengdu. I can say Gujarat, but why Chengdu? So this paired comparison, I think that really are your bigger contribution. So make good use of it, and also explain why these two pairs.
I'm told we can go a little longer, so I think there will be time for very brief responses by the paper givers. So please do take note of the questions and comments and formulate your responses.
If that's the case, may I ask Prakash to please tell us what was the China aspect to it that you didn't get to?
In due course, yeah. Please take note of that. Yes, please. Yeah, please speak loudly since we don't have microphones.
I have two questions for the two last presentations. For your presentation, my question is, you talk about social justice, okay? And I think Professor Frazier pointed it out that stalling land acquisition doesn't mean less of justice, more of justice. The other aspect that I would like you to look at is when there is a successful land acquisition project, people are displaced. What happens to the people who are displaced? We are dealing with an urban phenomena where large numbers of people are moving into the urban setting, which are creating huge amount of problems in terms of social justice, at least in the context of India. So I think one aspect of land acquisition is this huge group of people who are being displaced, moved into, and the 2012 December, incident that took place in Delhi is now brought out as one of the markers of the problems that we are dealing with that sort of a displacement. And for Prakash, slightly cheeky, I completely agree your premises that one needs movements. I'm all for movements. I was there in Shinwar, Nandigram, all of that. But does movements lead to social justice, or where does one push that agenda? Because if one looks at Bengal, what happens when the movements themselves become establishment? Or, what does one do with that?
Yes, at the back, please. And please introduce yourself if you could.
My name is Jawaharlal Alka. I am a development practitioner. My question is for Dr. Bong. I thought that it might help to put his arguments in better focus and provide more context if we could talk a little bit about the relative scale of land acquisition in China versus India. How many square kilometers of land is being acquired? Question number two, can we focus more clearly on the difference between acquisition versus expropriation? Meaning, what percent of the market value of the land is the state typically providing to those whose land is being acquired or expropriated? I think once we can see these issues in a clearer perspective, then the whole question of land acquisition in China versus India becomes much more clear. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I think I was just going to add comments on your question about this land acquisition things. I have been searching for this kind of comparison about land, what's the size of the land acquisition. I think it's really difficult to come by because they have a different way to measure that. Especially, I think as China, you might have a rough numbers, but Indian, I think it's, we're having discussion with Prakash. I think this is really difficult to know what's the size of the land has been acquired. Okay, my question or comments on both papers, Prakash and Inghu's papers, can we actually find a common base to look at this, say using Prakash as a framework as about property rights? Are we talking about the same type of property rights when we look at the land acquisition here? Because I think it's, when we start to talk about this, the property rights, we have to define that, because there's a variety of the rights could be related to the property rights. It could be, the ownership. Both of you are talking about this ownership of things, and urine rights, which is, I think, is in the case of China, and transfer rights, and also the rights of the compensation and the rehabilitation, which is, I think, is the focus of your paper. So, do we? And actually, I would just ask both of you to give us a little bit, comparison, about, how when we talk about the property rights of the land. So, what specific rights are we talking about? Thank you.
Any other comments, questions? No. Okay. So I would just like to add one thought, and then I would invite the various speakers to respond. Try to please keep your responses to 2 minutes if you can. I know it's very difficult. It's going to be difficult, but I'm sure you're all anxious to leave. Just the following thought, irresponsible thought, since I have that privilege, is that I think we should think harder about the role of land in economic development and national development strategies generally. If you think about the reason for the enormous economic power of the United States, and it's the challenge it posed to European countries as it emerged as an important power. I feel that I can talk about this since actually at the India-China Institute we're also supposed to consider a third country, namely the United States, as part of our mandate. If you think about that, land was extremely important, obviously, the land-abundant nature of the United States, as international trade theorists would say. And that, of course, involves thinking of land in a broad sense. It's not just the physical land, though that was important. It was important, for instance, to the US-style production system, the assembly line production system, which often depended on having a large expanse of land. But more generally on being able to extract resources, use them wastefully by the standards of the old world. This was apparently explicitly an aspect of the Nazi economic thinking. I've been reading a very interesting book by Adam Tooze, who's an economic historian at Yale, on the way in which the Nazis thought about their grand strategy. And basically they thought of the US, according to him, as the real enemy, which they had to prepare to be able to deal with. And they thought of their European land war as being a preliminary step in their preparation for hegemonic contestation with the United States. And of course their ideas of living space, Lebensraum, eastward expansion were all bound up with this. It involved creating a possibility of a form of economic development which enabled them to contest the US by replicating its land-using approach to economic development. And I think, in some sense, although we see the limits of that economic strategy very, very, very directly today in the form of climate change and other evidence that, in fact, we don't have possibilities of limitless expansion. We very much have limits. Nevertheless, there's a sense in which the logic of national development strategies, which we are seeing, is one of replication of this mode, in which you think about clearing people from the land and using the land as much as possible to facilitate national development in one or another way. This is my responsible comment. I don't have any deep reflections about it, but it would be interesting to, beyond this, but it would be interesting to have some reactions at some point. 2 minutes each. I think we could proceed in the same way that we, same order in which we spoke. Please, Nirmala. And thank you for your very interesting presentation, which I have nothing to say about.
Thank you. I would like to react to what Professor Tansen said about sources. I totally agree. My work has been, in my work, I've basically looked at only the Indian sources, and I know the limitations of it. But looking at the British sources and the Japanese sources require resources and expertise, which I am working on it. Hopefully I'll be able to do it over a period of time. Professor Priyadarshi's book very helpful because he has translated the Chinese newspaper articles on INA activities in China and Subhash Chandra Bose's visit in China in 43 and 44. Both are very important. The book, as a collection of primary sources, is a very important book, and I have been using it. But what I meant was that he doesn't really, it's not an analysis of the INA's activity in China. So I haven't looked at the Modern Review and the Indian Annual Registry, which I will do after I get back home. Your comment on Pan-Asianism is well taken, sir, and I'll look into it. And also the question, the comment on whether it's a Japan question instead of a China question. I never thought of it. I know it made me think, actually. Thank you. And the question that Professor Liu Jian asked, why did Subhash think of taking help from Japan? Very complicated question. But Subhash itself was a very complicated man, and probably after, but I could only say that, like I said in my presentation, he wanted to make the most of the opportunities which the war, which came out of the war. And probably the foremost thing in his mind was India's independence rather than what Japan was doing to China or doing in China. So that's all I can say. Professor Menier's suggestion, very well taken, ma'am. I'll incorporate it when I rework my paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Since a lot of questions toward our two language questions, how to? I think I cannot respond one by one. So, firstly, I will say that to discussant provide me very good suggestion toward further research. So, as I mentioned, this is just the beginning of my research. So many things have to take into the further research. So that's very useful for me. And other things I need to, I think what I'm saying is like that actually India and China, they are in different kinds of the stage of modernity. That's what I'm saying. That's what I am, that's why I come to this question, just because I think about Birmingham Mall, the social origin of the democracy and dictatorship and democracy. That's why. So that means, like, in terms of the urban population rate, in terms of the manufacturing. So I think there's far more than economic growth difference between India and China. There will be a different society. China will soon become more and more intellectual society, and India maybe more rural. But in India, as the Birmingham showed, Indian pursuit is modernity through non-violence rather than capitalism revolution or communism revolution. So this means they are going on their own way, approach modernity. So that's what I'm working on here. Through this land, we can see a lot of things in this land acquisition. A lot of things are implemented in this kind of issues. So that's what I'm trying to working on. I want to understand what there are different approach to modernity, even though there are difference of ideology toward modernity. But even this kind of different ideology toward modernity of development is some kind of dependent variable we need to look into. We need to look into why Indians think they're thinking about modernity, they are thinking about development is totally different from China. Why this happen? So this is what I'm long-term project I'm trying to work on. So this is so. Just thank you for your suggestion. I will take serious about all your suggestions. Thank you very much. Yes.
I think we should call you Barrington Moore from now on. It's quite an impressive statement of your future project.
Thank you to the two commentators. Thank you so much for sort of indulging me in a variety of arguments. And as I really appreciate your bearing through my very disorganized paper. And I'll run through, just one comment from each of the commentators and respond to some of the other questions. I look at the question of the whole discussion of constitutional rights from an everyday state perspective. So anything that doesn't filter onto the ground and is not effective in actually assuring the effective of rights on the ground is for me kind of, up there, but it doesn't really work. But it doesn't mean it's not important, but I think I'm unable to sort of integrate that into my discussion as effectively as I probably should do. On Nimmi's question about the discourses of dispossession and their delegitimization, that's my struggle between my heart and my mind. So I think I'll leave it at that. Tansen's, my hypothesis, I was going to give you some hypotheses about China-India comparative studies, and my argument would be that nature of state-society relations in India are much more heterogeneous internally compared to what they are in China. And because of that, the comparative studies of India-China should be sub-national studies. And I think Huang's proposal of studying one region in India and one region in China is perfectly along that line. So that's my idea of sort of and it borrows from some of the literature on property rights in Africa and all of that. Movements, I critically engage with movements, and that's why I think they struggle. So I think that makes sense. Property rights, the nature of property rights, we want to do that. I think that should be the next project, to map exactly the nature of property rights and how they are being reapportioned or acquired or expropriated. And that's all. Thank you.
So I think we will have concluding remarks now from Mark Frazier, Professor Frazier, my colleague.
Yes, very quickly. I know what I'm standing between you and the reception and the next discussion, actually. So I was invited to make some remarks that would sort of bookend the opening comments from this morning, and I thank Ashok for that. I was particularly struck by the concept of margins that Ashok frequently brings up, and I think margins and borders and movement across borders is also a way of thinking about this. I prefer, myself, margins is a many-layered concept, a many-layered term. What is marginal to one person may be mainstream to another. If you talk to people who work on Latin America or Africa, and you say India-China Institute, they'd say, oh, well, how do I get to the margins? If that's the margins, India and China, everyone's talking about them these days. So I don't want to give the emerging scholars the impression that you're stuck in the margins. You're in what I think is a very interesting, you could call it margins, you could call it mainstream, but a border crossing space that we all engage in different ways. I prefer border crossing, and I think it fits well with, it turns out very well, with all of the papers that we had today. If I was asked to write a concluding chapter to a co-edited volume, if we were going to try to do that from this, and I know we're not, I would really say that in one way or another, all of these papers today dealt with the issue of border crossing. We're talking about border outposts. We're looking at hybrid forms that exist in political economies between people on either sides of often arbitrary borders. We're seeing how mainstream approaches fit or don't fit, or if they don't fit, how they need to be revised when we're placing something like property rights into the historical and political and cultural context of China and India. And the other thing we're doing today, of course, is crossing the border between junior and senior scholars. To be more specific about it, we had the papers, we had Himalayan border, we had linguistic borders, we had investment borders this morning, the creation of investment zones, which is a new kind of bordering space. In the afternoon, we saw the literal military occupation and the borders that entails and the ambiguities that entails for the people inside the occupied territories. And of course, land acquisition with the last two papers, the state-led project of drawing borders, of saying this will be be an area that we designate for development. We decide who will get to live in it, who will not be able to live in it, and what we do with these areas to be brought under development, so-called. A word to the emerging scholars, a few words. I think that I hope you'll agree with me that this has been a great opportunity for you. I very much wish that someone in the mid-1990s had invited me to bring my work in progress, my recent PhD out, to engage in a conversation of people who were not comparative political scientists or political economists, and I had the chance to receive a different kind of feedback than you would normally get, and I hope that it has been useful for each of you. Remember that we'll be posting the recording of today's session, that which was able to be recorded by the mic. The questions, I guess, are outside that border. But we'll be posting this soon, in a few days, and you can go back. I would encourage you to go back and listen to the discussants' comments and your own presentation. But for feedback, listening to the discussants' remarks on your paper a second time might be especially useful to get things that you may have missed the first time around today. Please keep us apprised of your progress, of publications that might be forthcoming. Some of them are noted in your bios today, but we're particularly interested in the ways in which your engagement with the China-India comparison has generated useful publication venues for your research. Finally, I want to say personal thanks because I don't get to very often, but to my colleagues at the India-China Institute, both Ashok and Sanjay Reddy, and in particular, though, for today's session, for all the work that was involved in putting this together and putting it together so well. I want to thank the ICI staff. Ashok mentioned by name this morning, of course, but I want to add my personal thanks to all the work that went into this and carrying it off so well.